Well, I'm James Clay. I've spent the last 25 years in further education. I've been a teacher, I've been a library manager, I've been in charge of learning technologies, I've even been a director of IT. Currently, I'm a project manager for a large educational agency who shall remain nameless, JISC, and I'm working on a project on building digital capabilities. So, Martin, you said you wanted to talk about free.
Go ahead, yeah, free stuff.
You know, just been chatting with Martin before we started, and one of the things came out was, what did I want to talk about? Well, actually, one aspect was maybe looking at things like free tools, free software. And one of the ones that I've been using for many years and a great fan of is Wordpress, which is a great piece of free software. You've got two aspects to it. One, you've got the kind of WordPress.com, which is free to use, easy to use. Anyone can just go in there, put in the email address and set up a blog. And then you've actually got kind of WordPress.org, which is that you then download and install and make sure you don't get hacked, sort of thing, in terms of doing. I think that's one of the kind of constraints about free that we sometimes forget. Free and open source software actually does require somebody with expertise and skills to be able to install it, manage it, and maintain it. And that's where a cost can come in. You can either a cost in terms of hiring somebody to do it, a cost in terms of training yourself up to do it, or if you use something like WordPress.com, then you've got a cost in terms of advertising, in terms of doing it. So you get adverts plastered all over your blog, which can then be quite inconvenient. But one of the things I like about WordPress is just its sheer flexibility. I mean, it's just, there's so many things you can do with it. Use it as a day-to-day blogging piece of software, you know, put there daily entries, weekly entries, whatever you want to do. But one of the things about blogging I always like is the tagging. So suddenly you can create a whole series of posts related to a single tag. Now, I've done that quite a few times in various blogs. On my e-learning blog, for example, I do 100 ways to use a VLE. You know, which is basically number one, create a scroll of death. Number two, create a scroll of death. Three, create a longer scroll of death. No, but it was, you know, that whole series of articles was done for two reasons why, really. One was very much about, okay, I'm into this blogging. How am I going to do this? And it was about setting myself a kind of like a goal. Every week I would publish a guide on how to use the VLE. And to me, that was a good way of getting that kind of, because it's often with these tools, you start it, get really enthusiastic, you write 4 or 5 blog entries on day one, and then you kind of, then it just kind of goes away. And I thought, no, let's set a weekly time. So, but as a result, you can click on the category 100 ways to use a VLE, and bang, there's I think there's 89. I haven't quite got to 100 yet, even though it's probably been a bit longer than 100 weeks since I started the blog. But that was one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, was staff said, how do I use the VLE? And I think that's one of the key things is, and you can talk this again, you talk about free. This is about freeing up people's perceptions and assumptions about how a technology can be used. So if people look at a technology, they often see it as a way of, well, you know, the word VLE is about putting content online. That's how it always kind of starts off. We get that kind of scroll of death in Moodle, long lists of content, repository in terms of, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but often people don't understand what to do next. They've not been told that. We assume that they know how to do this. They know how to use tools like the VLE effectively to support teaching and learning. But as a result, lots of people use it as a repository. It gets a bad press. And as a result, people then say, you know, I'm not going to use it because everyone says it's a bad thing to do. We kind of almost shoot ourselves in the foot in that respect. So, you know, that series of articles was about freeing up people's perceptions about what a VLE is. I think the other aspect to kind of WordPress is, when we go a little bit deeper into it, is the amount of flexibility it has. So, you know, I've been looking at it more recently as a potential, you know, kind of learning management system or a VLE replacement. I might come back to what I mean by VLE, because I think sometimes we get constrained by that. But if you know, if I look at WordPress, there are a huge range of plugins that you can do. So one of the aspects is simple one, social sharing. So you go onto the blog, you read an article, you read a piece of content, and then you can share it in your networks, whether it be Facebook, Pinterest, Tumblr, and all those kind of things. That kind of aspect says, okay, we're not, the WordPress is in isolation, the VLE isn't in isolation, it's part of a wider picture. We know there are social networks out there that people use. I mean, I'm a great fan of Google Plus, I think it is, you are, aren't you, Martin? And one of the things about Google Plus is because nobody else really uses it in some respects. But what I like about it, it's a different. I suppose I like it because I go, now I'm really showing my age here. I really like JISC. And you know, if you don't know what that was, do a Google search for it. But Google bought it, and actually a lot of the features are in Google Plus. But one of the things I liked about JISC was the ability to have more than a bigger conversation around a theme of more than 140 characters. You can do that on Twitter. You can kind of do it on Facebook. with all the poking and all the other silly things that happen in there. But I like Google Plus for that serious discussion and debate that can happen. I've had some really good online discussions within Google Plus. But just going back, so in WordPress, you know, that social, this concept of that people only use one tool, one site is a kind of a mutant, and you've got to free that up. So I'm going to keep running the word free in now and again in terms of doing it. The other aspect of WordPress, that kind of things, is you can add that kind of social activity within the WordPress as well. So you can create a social network on WordPress. And for some people who say, well, actually, we don't want to ask students to go and join Facebook, we don't want to ask students to go and join Twitter. Well, actually, you can have that kind of social interaction within WordPress in itself. And as a result, with the multi-site aspect of WordPress, students can have their own blogs. And I sometimes think we forget the value of what blogging is, you know, and it's about being reflective. It's about thinking about what you've learned. It's thinking about what you're going to do next. And actually, by getting students and teachers actually to write that down, it actually creates real possibilities in terms of helping them to develop their learning. And of course, it's there, they can take it with them. Now, this isn't new, because in the past you might have done this via something called a diary or a paper journal or something else. I mean, I remember doing my, I think it could have been my CERTED or something like that. Oh, I did a PGCE, but the one before that, the FATEC, Further and Adult Education Teacher Certificate. And one of the things I was asked to do there was keep a reflective journal, which I called hand wrote at the time in terms of doing it. But actually that kind of concept of how is my reflecting on my practice, what have I done, what have I learned, what am I going to do differently? That kind of is a really good way of for learners to maintain, keep that continuity when they're learning. And using something that doesn't have to be WordPress. It could be Google Plus, Blogger, or, you know, I mean, even Facebook group if you really want to go that way, or even, you know, things like Twitter. I mean, I think also in terms of from an organizational perspective, if you're going down the Office 365 route, Yammer has actually got great potential to do that as well. You can create groups for workers, for teams, and so on. Another aspect of WordPress that I quite like in terms of is the, I can't remember what it's called now. It's done the buddy presses. Yes, the forums. So immediately you can have discussion. So it isn't about, you know, a blog is a one-to-many form of communication. By adding in the forum, immediately it becomes a many-to-many. So that's something that you see in VLEs and stuff like that. And actually, I mean, it's one thing that I know a lot of people don't like to engage with their online forums, but the ability to add it in as and when necessary and when needed. And again, it's those great discussions that you can have. If I go back in time and look at the JISC online conferences, the online discussions that we had were sometimes the most in-depth and broad discussions that I've had at any conference, because normally at a live conference it's like any time for questions, 2 questions are asked, and that's it, on to the next session. So to me, that's one of the things I like about online conferences, is freeing up that ability to be able to discuss, and to discuss with the keynote. You know, often, you know, you don't get that chance, and I always remember with online conferences you could do that. Another aspect, and you know, open badges. So, for example, there are plugins now for WordPress to put in open badges. You use a piece of content, get a badge. I mean, there is still some debate about whether open badges add anything. You know, it's one of those things where because, oh, you know, when we were in the Scouts, we used to like to collect badges. And I'm thinking, when I was a Scout, I hated collecting badges. You know, I just wanted to have fun. That's why I went to Scouts, you know, in terms of doing it. But I think there's just something about how we can use badges, make sure that it's got some kind of value, accreditation of some kind. And of course, there's all those professional schemes out there. So one of the things I know that the Association for Learning Technologies are doing is looking at using open badges in order to enable someone to become a certified member, the CMOL scheme. And actually, to me, that's got like kind of real value. And if people like CILIP, the library professionals, were doing that, and Scott Arnold as well, we would have a framework that would actually give real value to something. So I do an activity, I do something, I get a badge, but when I've added all those badges up, I get something that I can then show within some kind of personal review or personal portfolio. And the same goes for learners. If employers value badges, then there is sense of doing it. But I don't, you know, I think it's going to be careful. But I like the fact that it's built into WordPress. You know, you just get a plugin and it just works. And of course, there's all the other things as well, you know, that you can add. There's a plugin called CoursePress. Now, actually, this is interesting because we talk about free. CoursePress isn't free. It's $19 a month or something like that. So you immediately, you know, and that's the difference, I think, between free as in freeing up, free as in free speech, and open. But actually, there's sometimes costs involved. And it's the same with other kind of things. So, Martin, you said earlier, you know, what do we talk about, free or open? Well, some open things aren't free and some free things aren't open, and it's kind of balancing out. And I think as education, people in education is working out, what is adding value more than that. And I think that we sometimes conflate that it has to be one way or the other. Everything has to be free, or everything has to be open, or everything has to be proprietary, or everything has to be closed. And actually, sometimes I think it's much more about using the best job in the best for the best to enable us to succeed in what we're trying to do.
Something came into my mind when you talk about WordPress, of course, is people can have their own blog, which you mentioned, that's a nice technology that you can have a personal version of it. And I noticed some people use WordPress as their main website. And of course, you can then have an institutional version of it by installing it either on hosted or on your own machines, and extend it, like extrude it into a bigger kind of scenario. That's really, really, really quite interesting.